They hadn't broken free. Nothing had. The yokes were still intact. The wood was uncracked, the hardware unfastened, the straps in the same condition they had been the evening before. And yet, by sunrise, both oxen were gone. One was found 3 miles south. The other was found 2 miles north. They had not gone together. Cal Pruitt had worked oxen his entire life, long enough to know exactly what they could do and what they could not. He was 38 in the fall of 1881. The 2 animals he kept, a matched pair of red Devon oxen he had raised from calves, were as reliable as anything on the property. Not fast, not clever, reliable. They came when called, stood when yoked, pulled when asked. He had raised them from 8 months old and had trusted them the way he trusted his axe and his fence posts. They were part of the reliable structure of the farm. He yoked them to the wood-cutting wagon every morning for 6 years, and they accepted it without difficulty. He unyoked them every evening at the east end of the woodlot and led them to the paddock. On the evening of November 2nd, he unyoked them at the end of the day, walked them to the paddock, and closed the gate. In the morning, the gate was still closed. The paddock was empty. He looked at the gate first. The gate was a simple wooden affair, a single bar dropped into iron brackets on either side. The bar was in the brackets. The brackets were undamaged. The gate itself was intact. He walked the paddock fence. It was a post and rail fence, 3 rails high, built for cattle and adequate for oxen, which were not climbers. He walked every foot of it and found no broken rail, no post pushed out, no gap that an animal the size of a Devon ox could have passed through. The paddock was whole. The oxen were not in it. He stood in the center of the empty paddock and thought. He went to the barn to see if they had somehow gotten into the barn. They were not in the barn. He checked the lean-to beside the barn and the hay storage and the water trough enclosure. He went back to the paddock. He looked at the ground. The ground in the paddock was soft from the previous week's rain. He could see the prints of the oxen from the evening before, the broad round hoof prints of their evening walk, pressed clear into the mud, leading from the gate to the far end of the paddock where they usually stood. He could see where they had stood, the churned ground of 2 large animals at rest, the deeper impressions from their weight. He could see where the prints led to the far end and stopped. He could not see where they led from the far end and out. He crouched and looked at the ground around the far end of the fence. If they had jumped the fence, if a Devon ox could jump a 3-rail fence, which it could not, there would be hoof prints on the other side, a landing, a departure. There were none. The ground on the outside of the fence was undisturbed. He stood up and looked at the paddock. The prints led in. They did not lead out. He checked the gate again. He lifted the bar and reset it, testing the resistance, confirming that the bar seated in the brackets with a particular click he knew. An ox pushing the gate from inside would not have the leverage to lift that bar. He had built the gate specifically with that in mind. He had kept livestock long enough to know what they could and could not open. He walked the fence a second time, more slowly. He pressed on each post. He checked each rail. He went back to the corner of the fence and checked the joint there, where the post met the rail in a mortised connection that, if it had given, would have left a gap. It had not given. He stood in the paddock and looked at the prints. He had no explanation for that. He found the first tracks a 1/4 mile from the paddock, not leading from the paddock, beginning. That was the only word for it. The tracks began, not at the paddock gate, not at the fence line, not from any point of exit he could identify. At a point in the east field, a 1/4 mile from the paddock, in the soft ground between 2 rows of cut corn stubble, there were ox tracks. He crouched over them, large, round, the distinctive split hoof of a Devon ox. His oxen. He knew their prints from years of working that ground. These were his animals' tracks. He looked back at the paddock. He walked back toward it, keeping his eyes on the earth. Soft ground the full quarter-mile. He had left his own prints walking it, evenly spaced, clear, his weight pressed into the mud. The oxen's prints were not there. A quarter-mile of undisturbed ground between the last prints in the paddock and the first prints in the field. If they had walked that distance, they had walked it without touching the ground. He looked at the tracks in the field. They went south. He followed them. The tracks in the field were wrong. The stride was wrong, not consistently wrong, which would have meant distress or speed, but inconsistently wrong. Some prints deeper than expected, some lighter. The spacing varied in a way that suggested the animal was not quite fully in contact with the ground. And once, over a stretch of perhaps 30 feet, the tracks simply stopped. The ground was undisturbed for 30 feet. Then the tracks resumed. He put his hand on the ground in the middle of the gap. Surface intact. No depression. No compression. Nothing heavier than morning air had crossed it. Nothing he knew could carry a Devon ox 30 feet. He looked at the depth of the prints on both sides of the gap. Identical before and after. Same weight, same pace. As if the 30 feet of nothing had not happened. As if the animal had simply continued walking through ground it did not touch. He stood up. Then he followed the tracks south. If stories like this find you on the road home, subscribe and ride along. His neighbor Hess found the first ox. Hess had a farm 2 miles south of the Pruitt property, and he was in his field when he saw the animal standing at the edge of the timber line. He recognized it, had seen Cal's Devon oxen on the road often enough to know them by sight. He went to it, and it let him approach. It was calm. It was not injured. It was wearing part of its harness. The neck collar, loose now, resting around its neck rather than fitted properly, as if it had been put on without care. He led it into his paddock and sent word to Cal. While he waited, he watched the animal. He had been around working oxen his whole life. He knew their behavior, and he knew their stillness, and he knew the difference between an ox at rest and an ox that had been in distress and had quieted. This ox was none of those things. It stood in the paddock with a quality that Hess would later try to describe and would not quite manage. A quality of attention, as if the animal were listening to something at a frequency he could not hear. He checked it for injuries. Nothing. He checked its eyes. Clear, dark, responsive to movement. He held his hand in front of its nose, and it breathed on him normally. It was a healthy ox. It was also, he would say when asked, wrong in a way he could not put his finger on. He led it into his paddock and sent word to Cal. Cal came that afternoon. He examined the animal carefully. The ox was himself. No injuries, no signs of distress, no indication of having traveled hard. Its hooves were no more worn than would be expected. It was simply there, 2 miles south of where it had been the previous evening, calm and unharmed. Cal looked at the neck collar. It was his collar. He knew it. He had put it on this animal himself the previous morning. It was in the same condition as when he had put it on, except that it was loose, not unfastened. He had not unfastened it. Loose, as if it had been put on improperly, as if the animal had been smaller when it was put on and had since grown. He looked at the ox. The ox looked back at him without expression. He asked Hess, "Did it seem right to you when you found it?" Hess thought about that. He said, "It was calm. More than calm, maybe. It was, still. It stood still in a way oxen don't usually stand still. Cal looked at the animal. He said, "Yes, that's how it looks now." He started back north the following morning to find the second ox. He had a rough sense of where to look. If the first had gone 2 miles south and the two animals had separated rather than going together, north was the direction. He took the road north, and he told himself he was looking for an animal that had walked on its own through the November Ozark country, and that the animal would be found at a farm or on a road or at a fence line, because that was where wandering animals were found. He found it on the far side of the ridge, 2.5 miles north. It was standing in a creek bed, not drinking, not oriented toward the water at all. Standing in the creek, in the shallow November flow, at an angle to the current, its head down but not grazing, its body still. The neighbor's boy had described it as looking like an animal that was listening, which Cal had heard and set aside until he got there and saw it himself and understood what the boy meant. The ox was standing in cold water in November, and its body had the posture of deep attention. Its ears were slightly forward. Its eyes were open and fixed on something ahead of it, not in the water, not at the opposite bank. Somewhere further. The north ridge, a mile away, its outline visible through the bare timber. Whatever the north ox was attending to, it was not in the creek. It was not in the creek bed. It was a mile away, in the direction the animal was facing, on the far side of a ridge that neither of them had any business being near. His neighbor's boy, who had been sent ahead on horseback, had found it that way an hour before Cal arrived, and in that hour, the ox had not moved. Cal waded into the creek and put his hand on the animal's neck. The ox was cold. Not sick cold. Not the cold of an animal in shock or distress. Cold in the way an animal that had been standing in cold water for a long time was cold. He had been a farmer long enough to recognize the difference. He led the ox out of the creek. It came without resistance, the way the first ox had come. Too easily, too willingly, with the compliance of an animal that was not choosing to follow, but was simply not choosing to resist. He led it up the bank and onto the grass, and it stood where he put it and looked at the north ridge. It was still wearing its yoke bow. Not the full yoke. The yoke would have been on the wagon, undisturbed, which it was. Which was another thing he had not yet been able to account for. Just the bow, the curved wooden piece that fitted under the animal's neck. The bow was undamaged, uncracked, the pin that held it in place still seated. The yoke bow did not come off an ox without removing the pin. The bow was the curved piece of wood that fitted under the animal's neck, the piece that, together with the yoke beam above, held the animal in the harness. To remove the bow from an ox, you lifted the bow up and out of the iron staple on the yoke beam. And to do that, you first removed the wooden pin that locked the bow in position. It was a 2-step process that required hands. The pin was in place. He had made this pin himself, from seasoned oak, fitted to specific tolerances. He recognized it. He had not replaced it. It was the same pin it had always been, in the same position it had always been in. An ox could not remove its own yoke bow. A person could remove the bow and replace the pin. He looked around the creek bed, the bank on both sides, the timber behind him. Nobody was there. He looked at the ox. The ox looked at the north ridge. He looked at the bow for a long time. He looked at the ox. The ox looked at the north ridge. He brought both animals home over 2 days. The first ox he led back from the Hess farm without difficulty. It walked beside him, and it stopped when he stopped, and it moved when he moved. And if there was something wrong with it, he could not have articulated what it was. It was doing everything correctly. It simply felt different than it had felt before. He had worked this animal for 6 years. He knew how it felt to walk beside it. This was not quite the same. He told his wife this when he came in from the barn on the 3rd evening. She was at the table with the lamp lit, the way she was at the table in the evenings when the day's work was done. She had heard the account over the previous 2 days, had heard it as it developed piece by piece, as he came in and reported what he had found, and what he had done, and what he still did not understand. She had heard it with the same quality of attention she brought to most things, which was complete and patient. He told her about walking beside the south ox, and she set down what she was holding and looked at him. She asked him to describe the difference. He said, "It's like walking beside a thing that is shaped like the ox and does what the ox does, but is not entirely the ox." She looked at him. He said, "I know how that sounds." She looked at the ox through the kitchen window. She said, "What does it do differently?" He thought about it. He said, "It doesn't do anything differently. That's the thing. It does everything the same. It comes when I call, it stands at the gate, it moves when I lead it. All of it the same." She waited. He said, "It's the way it does them. There's a quality to how it does them that is different. Like, you know how you can tell when a person is only doing something because they have to? When there's no intention in it, just compliance?" She said, "Yes." He said, "That." She looked at the animal in the paddock. She said, "Both of them?" He said, "Yes, both of them." She said, "Which one is this?" He said, "The south one, the one that Hess found." She said, "And the north one?" He said, "I haven't brought the north one home yet." He walked home from the Hess farm slowly, leading the south ox beside him. The road between Hess's farm and his own was 2 miles of November road, the particular gray and brown of the Ozark hill country in the last weeks before the first real freeze. The trees stripped, the fields cut, the whole landscape reduced to its bones. He had walked this road hundreds of times. He knew every rise and bend of it. He was aware, walking it that day, of the animal beside him. He had walked beside this animal hundreds of times too. He knew the particular rhythm of an ox at the lead, the cadence of its breathing, the way its weight transferred through the road when it walked. He had calibrated himself to this animal over 6 years. What was walking beside him felt right in every measurable detail, and wrong in some way he could not measure. He stopped once on the road and turned to look directly at the animal. The ox looked back at him with the same dark, quiet eyes it had always had. He turned and kept walking. He did not stop again. He went back for the north one the next day. He led it down from the ridge and along the road and into the paddock, and it came without complaint, without struggle, without any of the resistance that oxen could show when they were unhappy. It came with the perfect compliance that was somehow worse than resistance. He put both animals in the paddock and closed the gate. He went in for supper. He did not go back to look at them that evening. He tried to work them the following week. Not on the same ground, not at the woodlot where they had been working when he unyoked them on November 2nd. He tried them in the south field, on a different task, a different wagon. He watched them as he yoked them, watched the moment when the yoke beam settled across the back of their necks, the moment they accepted the familiar weight of it. Before November, there had been a quality to that moment that he had never articulated, but had always felt. A settling in, a kind of animal consent. They came to the yoke. They accepted it. They pulled. He worked them for 2 hours in the south field. The work was done correctly. The ground was moved as it needed to be moved. He could not have identified, from the outside, any difference in the way the work was accomplished. From the inside, it felt entirely different. He drove them back to the paddock at noon and unyoked them, and stood in the paddock for a moment and looked at them. They looked back at him with the dark, quiet eyes they had always had. He went in for dinner, but they would not work the woodlot. He took them up the east road toward the woodlot on the second week, and they stopped at the point where the road bent toward the timber. Both of them, simultaneously, on a road they had taken hundreds of times. They stopped with the same quality he had seen in the creek-standing ox, not the planted, fighting refusal of an animal being forced somewhere dangerous, but the simple cessation of forward motion, like a watch stopping. Both of them. He tried 3 times over 3 days. The third time he pushed harder, used the voice and the command and the weight of his expectation, all the accumulated authority of 6 years of working these animals. They stopped at the same point. He stood behind the yoke and looked at the road ahead and looked at the animals. The woodlot was perhaps a quarter-mile ahead, around the bend. The road was the same road they had taken 5 or 6 times a week for 6 years. Nothing had changed on the road. He could see it, the wheel ruts of his own wagon, the familiar trees on either side, the bend where it curved toward the timber. The oxen stood at a point 50 feet before the bend. They had been standing there for 3 minutes. He had seen stubborn oxen. He had worked with animals that didn't want to do things, and you pushed them through it, and they did it. And that was the relationship between farmer and animal, which was one of mutual necessity. The pushing mattered. The authority of the demand mattered. Animals responded to it. He had been pushing for 3 minutes, and the animals had not moved, not fighting him, not leaning back, not bracing, not any of the active resistance of a stubborn animal. Simply still. The same quality of stillness he had seen in the creek-standing ox. The same quality he had seen in the paddock the mornings since they came back. The watch stopped. He did not push the 4th time. He turned them south and took them back to the farm. He found other work for them. The first winter after November, he watched them carefully and tried to find the line between compliance and something like intention. He did not find it. He asked his wife once, "Do you notice anything different about them?" She came to the fence and looked at the animals in the paddock. She said, "They look the same." He said, "Yes." She said, "I don't want to go near them. Not from fear, I just don't want to." He nodded. She went back to the house. He looked at the animals. They looked back at him with the dark, quiet eyes they had always had. They pulled timber in the south field. They moved stone from the creek bed for fence repair. They did the ordinary heavy work of a working farm, and they did it without complaint. And he used them and watched them and thought about what Galt had said and did not stop thinking about it. Not the same ones. He watched them work and thought, what does that mean exactly? What had gone somewhere that night that was not the shape and weight and habit of his animals, but was the thing that made them his animals, rather than 2 red Devon oxen that belonged to someone else? He did not have a word for what he was describing. He had been a practical man his whole life, and he dealt in what was demonstrable. This was not demonstrable. But it was there, in the difference he felt walking beside the south ox on the road home, in the quality of compliance that was somehow worse than stubbornness. He found other work for them. They could still be worked, just not there. In the weeks between finding the animals and his winter accounting, Cal noticed a change in the property, not in anything he could point to directly. The farm was the farm, the barn was the barn, the fields were the fields, the paddock was the paddock. Nothing physical had changed, but the property felt different. He noticed it first in the evenings, sitting on the porch after supper the way he had always sat. The view from the porch took in the east field, the tree line beyond it, and the corner of the woodlot. He had looked at that view for 14 years, without it feeling like anything other than what it was. His land, his trees, his timber. After November 2nd, it felt watched. Not dramatically. Not in any way that he could describe as frightening, exactly. Just a quality of being observed from the edge of his vision, from the direction of the woodlot that had not been there before. He turned to look directly, and there was nothing. Trees, tree line, the ordinary dark of November timber. He stopped sitting on the porch in the evenings. He told himself it was getting cold. He spent the winter trying to account for it. The practical accounting first, the way he always started. What had happened that could have happened? What sequence of events, what failure of equipment or animal behavior could explain what he had found? He went through it carefully. The oxen had been in the paddock at nightfall. The paddock was intact in the morning. There were no exit tracks. There were tracks in the field a quarter-mile away, with a 30-foot gap in them. Both animals had been found miles away, calm, wearing their equipment in conditions that required the equipment to have been removed and improperly replaced, or to have been neither removed nor replaced. The yoke bow required its pin to be removed before an ox could step out of it. The pin was in place. He could not construct a sequence that accounted for all of that. He had tried the obvious ones. A person had taken the animals from the paddock and walked them out. But how, with the gate barred and the fence intact and no exit prints in the soft ground? A person had taken them from the field where the tracks began. But a quarter-mile gap between the paddock and the field remained, and no person had been seen. And why would a person walk them miles in opposite directions and leave them at a creek bed and a timber line? He had tried the sickness explanations, the predator explanations, the explanations that involved coincidence and misremembering. None of them worked. The equipment evidence was the part that closed each explanation in sequence. The neck collar loose as if it had been put on wrong. The yoke bow still in place with its pins seated. These were not conditions that resulted from an animal wandering. These were conditions that resulted from something removing equipment and replacing it improperly, or from equipment that had changed its relationship to the animal wearing it. He had been working with harness and yoke for 24 years. He did not know how the second condition was possible. He knew a man who had been in the Ozarks longer than he had. An old man named Galt, who had trapped and farmed this country for 50 years. He rode to Galt's farm in January, when the roads were frozen hard and the farm work was light enough to allow it. And he tied his horse at the gate and went to the door. Galt was 80-something. He had been in this country since before the farms were farms, since the logging operations first came into the drainages, since the hill country was the kind of country where you might go weeks without seeing another person. He knew the Ozarks in the particular way of someone who had been formed by them rather than imported to them. He had buried 3 wives and 2 sons in this country, and had outlasted them all and had not spoken of leaving. Cal had met him a handful of times over the years. At mills, at the road, the occasional exchange of accounts between men who worked the same general territory. He did not know Galt well, but he knew Galt's reputation, which was for knowing the hill country better than anyone alive. He told him the account. Galt heard it all the way through without interrupting. He was quiet for a while. Then he said, "The track stopped and started again." Cal replied, 30 feet of clear ground, nothing in it. Galt was quiet again. He said, "The bow pin was still in." Cal said, "Yes." Galt looked at his hands. He said, "In 50 years in this country, I have seen things I couldn't account for. Animals that went somewhere they couldn't have gone. Things found where they couldn't be. I don't have a name for what that is." He paused and said, "But I have noticed that the animals that it happens to are never quite the same after. That's the part I think about. Not where they went. What came back. Cal looked at him and said, "What do you mean?" Galt repeated, "Your oxen came back, didn't they?" Cal replied, "Yes." Galt said, "The same ones." Cal did not answer for a moment. Then he said, "They look the same." He paused. "They do what they did before. They come when called. They accept the yoke. They pull. They sleep in the paddock and eat when fed and do everything right." Galt listened. He said, "But." Cal thought about how to say it. He said, "But there's nothing behind it. Before November, when I worked beside those animals, I felt like I was working with something. Something that was choosing to work with me. Something that had preferences and moods and opinions about the work, even if they kept most of it to themselves. Now I feel like I'm working with something that does the work because work is what it does. Not because it's an ox that has decided to work with me." Galt looked at his hands. He said, "Like the difference between a man who helps you because he wants to and a man who helps you because that's his job and you're there." Cal said, "Yes." Galt said, "And you're asking me if the same things came back?" Cal said, "Yes." Galt said, "The same ones?" Cal did not answer for a moment. "They look the same." Galt said, "Yes, that's what I mean." Cal Pruitt farmed the property for 19 more years. He was not haunted by it, which was a word some people used when they heard the account and tried to categorize what had happened to him. He did not use that word. He had not been visited by anything, had not been followed, had not been harmed. His animals had gone somewhere and had come back changed, and he had lived with that change for 8 years. And the change had died in the spring and the autumn of 1887. And that was what it was. He was not haunted. He was simply a man who had seen something he could not explain and had carried the fact of it the way you carried facts you could not explain, alongside the rest of what you knew, part of the total account, there when you thought about it and not consuming you when you did not. The oxen worked for 8 of those years, not at the woodlot, which they never approached again, but everywhere else on the property. They pulled and hauled and did what working oxen did. They were never sick. They never caused trouble. They were also never again what they had been before November. He noticed this across the years in small ways that he would not have been able to catalog if asked. Nothing dramatic enough to describe, nothing anyone else would have seen in a passing glance. But he had worked these animals for 6 years before November and 8 years after, and he knew the difference. Before, they had opinions. Not dramatically, not loudly, but in the way working animals had opinions. A slight resistance when they preferred a different route, a moment of stubbornness when they were tired. The particular personality of animals that had been worked long enough to have developed preferences. After, nothing. They did what was asked of them. They came when called, they pulled, they rested. They ate when fed and stood when left. No opinions, no preferences, no moments of being anything other than compliant. He had wanted to work with them, not with something that simply did work. The distinction mattered to him, and he could not have explained it to anyone who had not worked animals long enough to understand it. They were never sick. They never caused trouble. They lived out their full working years, and he replaced them, eventually, with a different pair. The different pair worked the woodlot without hesitation. He watched them do it the first time and felt something he could not name. He had expected to feel relief. The relief of animals working normally again, of the woodlot accessible again, of the property returned to its full functioning. He felt something, but relief was not quite the word. He stood at the edge of the woodlot and watched the new pair work and thought, they don't know. They don't know about the gap in the east field. They don't know about November. They came to this woodlot with no history of it, and they work it without hesitation. And what happened here 8 years ago is not in their experience. He thought, my animals knew something. Whatever they encountered on the night of November 2nd, it was something they recognized, or something that recognized them. And they went to it, and came back not quite the same. He thought, the new pair doesn't know to be anything other than what they are. My old pair knew something they didn't tell me. He watched them do it the first time and felt something he could not name. He did not tell anyone about Galt's question, the one about whether what came back was the same as what had left. He held it the way he held a few other things in his life. The things that had no resolution, but also no urgency. The things that were simply true and unprovable and required no action. The South Ox died in the spring of 1887. He found it in the morning, in the paddock, lying in the position of an animal that had lain down for the last time. No signs of disease or injury. It had simply stopped. He stood at the paddock fence and looked at it for a while before he went in. The North Ox died the following autumn. He buried them at the edge of the south field. He had thought about where to bury them for some time before he decided. He had thought about the woodlot, which was where they had worked most of their lives. He had thought about the paddock, which was where they had lived. He chose the south field because that was where the tracks had been. The tracks that went south toward Hess's farm, toward where the first one had been found. He did not know why he chose it for that reason. He thought about it while he dug. The ground in November was not yet frozen, just cold and stiff, and the digging was hard work. He worked without stopping. He thought about the tracks in the south field, about the gap in them, about the point where the tracks resumed after the 30 feet of nothing. He had followed those tracks south. He had found the South Ox 2 miles from where the tracks began. He had led it home. He did not know what else he had led home. He just did. After the burial, he stood at the grave for a while. He was not a man who made much of animal deaths. He had worked livestock his whole life, and he had buried animals before, and he had not stood at the graves. He stood at this one. He was trying to decide something that he had been trying to decide for 8 years, since Galt had asked him. The same ones. He had never given Galt an answer, or only the answer that they looked the same, which both of them had understood was not the answer to the question. Standing at the grave, he thought he had an answer. He thought, no, not the same ones. He thought, what came back wore the same shape and did the same work and lived in the same paddock. But whatever had been particular to those animals, whatever had made them patient and steadfast in the private names he had given them, that had not come back. He did not know where it had gone. He stood at the grave for a while. Then he walked back to the barn. He did not look at the woodlot. He had not looked directly at the woodlot in 8 years. He looked toward it sometimes, the way you looked toward something you were aware of in your peripheral vision. He did not look at it directly. He just did. Several people came to hear the account. Cal told it plainly to those who asked. He told the gate intact in the morning, the prints leading in but not out. The tracks beginning a 1/4 mile from the paddock, the 30-foot gap. Both animals found miles away in opposite directions, the equipment in conditions that required either removal and replacement or no removal at all. Most people heard it and said variations of the same things. Something must have spooked them, and they'd gotten out somehow, and the tracking was harder in November ground than you'd think. Cal let these responses sit without argument. He had checked the ground. He knew what the ground had shown him. One person who heard it was a farmhand named Tully, who worked for a neighbor 3 miles north. Tully was the one who had first seen the North Ox, had seen it from the road before the neighbor's boy was sent out. He had not been asked, and he had not said anything because he did not know who to say it to, and he was not sure what he had seen, and he did not want to be the kind of person who said things he was not sure of. Cal found this out from the neighbor, who mentioned it offhand. He went to find Tully. Tully described what he had seen. An ox standing in the creek, facing away from him, its head down. He had watched it for a minute from the road before he went to report it. Cal said, "You said you weren't sure what you'd seen." Tully thought for a moment. "When I first saw it, from the road, it was facing away. By the time I got to the creek to look, it was facing north. The ridge." Cal looked at him. "That's 100 yards. You walked 100 yards to get to the creek." Tully said, "Yes." Cal said, "And in that distance it turned." Tully said, "Yes." Or it had already turned and I hadn't noticed which way it was facing from the road. Cal said, "But you noticed it enough to say you weren't sure." Tully was quiet. It was the way it turned. I wasn't looking at it when it happened. But I had the feeling. You know the feeling when something moves and you catch the tail end of it? Cal said, "Yes." Tully continued. It turned without moving its feet. Cal looked at him. Tully said, "I know how that sounds." No one ever found an account of what happened on the night of November 2nd, 1881. Cal Pruitt told the account many times over the following years. He told it the same way every time, which was plainly and in order and without embellishment. He was not a man who told stories for effect. He told this one because people asked and because it was true, and because he did not see any reason to keep true things to himself. He told it to Owen Pruitt, a different Pruitt, no relation, who farmed 3 miles to the east. Owen heard it and asked 2 questions. The first was, "What do you think took them?" Cal said he did not know. The second was, "What do you think they went to?" Cal had not been asked the second question before. He was quiet for a while and said, "I have thought a lot about the direction, north and south. Opposite directions, the same distance roughly, as if they were drawn outward, like something was pulling them apart." Owen said, "From what?" Cal thought. From the center. From whatever was at the center of whatever happened. They were at the center of the farm, in the paddock, and whatever it was pulled them apart from that center. One north and one south, and neither of them going to it. Both going away from it. Owen said, "So the thing wasn't pulling them toward itself." Cal said, "I don't know. Maybe. Or maybe they were pulled by the thing going, rather than by the thing coming, like a current when the water drops. The thing left, and they were pulled in the wake of it." Owen thought about that, and said, "And brought back changed." Cal said, "Yes." He was not a man who told stories for effect. He told this one because people asked and because it was true, and because he did not see any reason to keep true things to himself. He answered every question that was asked of him. What he could not answer, what no one who heard the account could answer, was the central question of how. How did the animals leave the paddock without disturbing the gate or the fence? How did the tracks start a 1/4 mile from where they should have started? How did an ox cross 30 feet of soft ground without printing it? How did the yoke bow come to be on an animal with its pin in place? He had no answers. He said so plainly, "I have told you what I found. I don't know how it happened. I have spent 11 years thinking about how it happened, and I have no answer. The only thing I know is what came back was not quite the same. Not from the animals, which could not account for it. Not from anyone on the road between the Pruitt property and where the oxen were found, though people were asked. The road between the Pruitt property and the Hess farm was a working road, traveled by the farms along it with regularity. On the night of November 2nd, by Cal's accounting, his South Ox had traveled 2 miles along or near that road. He asked the farms along the route whether anyone had seen or heard an ox, or anything at all unusual, on the evening or night of November 2nd. 3 households had been awake at various points in the night. None of them had seen an ox on the road. None had heard hoofbeats. None had seen anything moving. He had found tracks that showed an animal moving south. He had found the animal 2 miles south. Whatever had connected those 2 facts had not been visible to anyone who might have seen it from their house or road. He asked the same questions about the North Road and got the same answers. Not from anyone on the road between the Pruitt property and where the oxen were found, though people were asked. The 30-foot gap in the tracks was seen by 3 other people besides Cal, his son, his neighbor Vas, and the old man Galt, who came to look in the spring when the ground was soft and the field showed the impressions still. Galt crouched over the gap for a long time. The ground had softened with the spring thaw. The gap was still visible, not as clear as it had been in November, the prints faded by winter and thaw and the new growth of March grass around them. But the gap was there. The soft November mud had preserved the impression of the prints deeply enough that the spring ground still held them. Lighter now, but present. And the gap between them was still clear. 30 feet of ground that showed no impression. Cal stood behind him and watched him look. Galt was a methodical observer. He had spent 50 years reading ground and water and the evidence of what animals and weather did to them. He moved slowly along the gap, looking at the ground on both sides, measuring the distance with his eyes, crouching and standing and crouching again. He put his hand on the ground in the middle of the gap. He held it there for a moment. Then he stood up. He did not say what he thought. He walked to the track on the far side of the gap and crouched over it. He measured the print with his fingers. He looked at the depth of it compared to the prints on the near side. He stood up. He stood up and looked at the track that continued on the far side and shook his head once, slowly, and walked back to the road. Cal's son asked him, "What do you think happened there?" Galt said, "I think something carried it." The boy asked, "What kind of something?" Galt looked at the field. He said, "The kind that doesn't leave tracks, not even of itself." He and Cal walked back to the road without speaking. At the gate, Galt stopped and looked back at the field. Cal said, "I've tried to think of what kind of thing that is." Galt looked at the field. The kind that moves through this country the way water moves through limestone. Through the spaces, not across the surface. Water doesn't leave marks on limestone because it goes into it. Your animals went somewhere they couldn't have gone by walking. And something went through whatever it moved through to get them there. I don't have a name for it. Cal looked at the field, at the gap between the prints, still faintly visible in the spring ground. Should I have done something different? Galt was quiet. I don't know what different would have looked like. You couldn't have stopped them going. You found them and you brought them back. That's all there was to do. He paused. The question I'd sit with is whether bringing them back was the right thing. Cal looked at him. Galt said, "Not a criticism. You didn't know. I'd have done the same. But I'd think about it afterward." Cal had thought about it for 11 years. The boy, he was 17 in the spring when Galt came to look, thought about that for years. He took over the farm from his father eventually, and he used the woodlot without incident. The Devon pair that replaced his father's animals worked the woodlot without hesitation, as Cal had said. And the next pair after that, and the ones after that. He never went to the spot on the east field where the tracks had the gap in them. Not because he had been told not to. His father had said nothing about it, had told the account plainly and without restriction. He just never went there. When he worked the east field, he worked the rest of it and left that section alone, and did not think about why. The section of field where the gap had been grew differently from the rest. He noticed this as an adult, in the years when he was paying close attention to the field. The section grew the same crop, but the stalks were slightly shorter and slightly sparser, as if something in the soil there was different from the soil around it. He did not plow it differently. He did not seed it differently. He left it as it was. He said, when his own son asked about it, "Your grandfather's animals went through there once." His son said, "What animals?" He said, "Oxen, a long time ago. Don't worry about it. The kind that doesn't leave tracks, not even of itself."